We're going to talk about the national debt today. As you can see, I do go for a walk, long walks. That gives me time to think. It's a really good concept and a good way of thinking. Now, everybody's complaining about the national debt being so high, but people don't realize how we got here. We got here because politicians will always be politicians. The need for oil is so important that we'll go to war with other countries just to preserve the price of oil, to control the price of oil. And that's the reality. And when the house market collapsed, the mortgage industry in 2008, it was something that I personally saw it coming. I personally wrote a letter to most of the senators and Congress that were in finance committees or candidates for president, including Senator Barack Obama at the time and Hillary Clinton and the other candidates. And I have said that the only way you can fix that house market collapse will be the interest rates. Federal Reserve will have to drop it down, and then the banks will have to refinance every loan that was subprime loan that was about to reset down to 4% interest. That's the only way we could have saved that coming. But now we got to remember this. A lot of people during that time said that President Bill Clinton left the surplus. Yes, he did. He did left the surplus on the budget. That's very important. It was on the budget, not the national debt. The national debt was still at $5.9 trillion. And yes, he did have a $600 billion surplus because at the time, he was cutting a lot of programs. He was cutting the military budget. I remember I was in the US Navy at the time. And because of his retirement formula at the time, I decided not to stay in for 20 years. Now I look back and I should have stayed because Bush came later on and changed it back to the old ways. But I was a young kid at the time. I didn't understand all that, how it works, how it doesn't work. But anyway, to get back to the national debt, when Bill Clinton left the office, yes, he did left a $600 billion surplus on the budget. That means more money was coming in taxes than what he spent with all his departments and foreign welfare, as I call it. I'm going to get to that point later on into the video. And then President Bush came to power, and he had a surplus the first year, but then 9/11 happened. 9/11 happened. It hit our financial institutions at the World Trade Center. It hit our Pentagon, and now everything will change for the next 8 years, or might as well just say for the next 18 years. And President Bush decided that he wanted to go to war with Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, some people might agree with it, some people disagree with the war. I think the war in Iraq was more of a personal war, and just because Saddam Hussein was who he was, and he did try to kill his father, the President Bush Sr., I understand that. And as I said, maybe that was a little bit more personal. But also, we have to remember that during the Clinton administration, because I was in the Navy, I know many times instead of going in a port visit, we end up going in the Persian Gulf and spend our 6-month deployment over there because Saddam was playing too many games. And I remember during that time when Saddam was saying, hey, I'll give you $25,000 to every family of a suicide bomber that kills American and Jewish. And that was the truth. Saddam did that. Now, getting back to that, I think that war was more a personal war. Afghanistan was more of a war that we had to fight on terror, but in reality, we all should have learned from our history, especially back in the 80s when the CIA, President Bush Sr. paid Osama bin Laden $4 billion to fight the Russians out of Afghanistan. So we should have looked at that, but we didn't. We haven't learned that fighting a war in Afghanistan, it will be almost impossible to win. But anyway, President Bush did add another $5 trillion to the national debt in his 8 years. Now, $5 trillion seems to be a lot, but compared to President Obama, that was not really that much. But it was a lot. And when you looked at it from the point of view that the national debt at the time was $5.9 trillion, and then Bush added another $5 trillion, and that made it $10.9 trillion in debt. Now, many people say, okay, $10.9 trillion, we can pay it. Yeah, we were paying $250 billion a year in interest, money that we didn't have. Now we have to borrow that money, and that's what I'm going to get more in depth with that. So 2007 came around. There were a lot of alarms coming around with the mortgage industry around 2007. Most real estate agents that really paid attention to it, like myself, at the time I was a real estate agent, I seen it coming, and I seen it coming with one of my neighbors, that his mortgage, the interest rates on his mortgage switched from 1.9% introduction that he got it in 2004, 2005, when he first bought the house. He paid $415,000 for that house. So his mortgage was roughly $1,800 a month at that low interest. But when it reset, this is very important, when it reset, it went up to 9.5% interest, close to 10%. He ended up having to pay $4,500 a month in mortgage. At that point, he realized he couldn't keep the house. At that point, I realized what was going on. And I said, that's why I put in those letters in 2007, 2008, especially early 2008. And I was sending them, and the office of my senator, Barbara Mikulski, called me, and her office said, look, Mr. Petrus, we understand the situation, but it's election year. We cannot do nothing about it. Nobody wants to talk about this issue. And that was understandable. Again, it was the election year. During election years, people don't want to talk about possible economy collapse. You know, they wanted to make it look like everything was okay, but it was not. We seen it coming. 2008 came around, right before the election. We only had 2 candidates running for office, and boom, the market collapsed. Now both of them had to suspend their campaigns to come back to DC to vote on what we call the bailout. The first bailout came around $700 billion to try to stabilize the market. Well, the problem with that was what made me like Senator Obama at the time, and that's because he hasn't been elected to president yet, was when he was talking about in Senate during the debt ceiling to be raised, and he said it's very un-American to keep borrowing money that we cannot pay back. And I look at him and I realize that the national debt already have gone $5 trillion. That's almost 100% in 8 years. That was a concern. And I looked at this young senator. I knew that he will become the president. And he has that mentality that, hey, we cannot keep borrowing money. Maybe we can figure out something that we can change. But in reality is, because of the policies during Bush's last 2 years in office, kind of created that collapse. In a way, it was good for the Democrats that it happened during the Bush time in office, and that could have waited another couple of months and it would be under the Democrats' watch. But of course, they will still blame the Republicans either or. It doesn't matter. They would. But at the end of the day, it is what it is. We went into that national debt at $10.9 trillion before Bush left office. Now, we already started losing millions of jobs. House market collapsed. The car industry collapsed. Everything started collapsing. It's a domino effect. If one industry doesn't survive, then every other industry will collapse. And I blame it on the mortgage industry because they're very greedy. You only have a piece of pie at the end of the day. And if the mortgage company takes the biggest piece of that pie, it's nothing left for other industry to chew on. And that's what happened during 2005, 2009, 2008, 2009 close. In some markets, the price of houses went through the roof. And unfortunately, we learned from that. We learned that some prime mortgages were not the greatest idea, but let's remember that idea came from President Bill Clinton. He was the one who pushed for that. He wanted every American to be able to afford a house. Nothing wrong with that. However, when you have a husband and a wife making $10 an hour, being able to buy 3 houses at $900,000 for all 3 houses, so $300,000 a piece, because there was a loophole in the system. You did not have to show documentation on your loans. By not showing those documentation on your loans, you were able to say, hey, I'm making $150,000 a year, when in reality I was only making $15,000 a year. But hey, nobody checked my employment, nobody checked my pay stubs, was all good. It looked good for the underwriter, no problem. Boom. They were hoping that they could take that $300,000 house, rent it for a year, and then resell it for $400,000. And that was most of people's idea. People that did that back from 2000 or 1998 through 2006, it worked perfectly fine for them. Bill Clinton made more millionaires than any other president. Now, but that ended up to cost us at the end. Now, President Bush didn't see it coming. He saw a healthy market, house market. He saw revenue coming in from the taxes, from the sales taxes. If something is not broken, you're not going to fix it, right? But sometimes you have to look if it's about to break. And if it's about to break, then you have to fix it. But again, politicians, they want to talk about that right before the election. Now, President Obama won the election. He came to power. He quickly changed from being the senator that I adore so much, that I really liked, by saying it's un-American to borrow money that we cannot pay back. Fortunately, now the table changed. You see, when you're a senator or a congressman, you don't have the same privileges as a president. You don't get to make those decisions at that level. So you see things different like we do. We the people don't see it, what the president have to go through and what the president have to do to keep everything running. Trying to work with a budget that we don't agree on. However, 8 years later, we end up with about $19 trillion in debt. Now we have a new president. Now we have to remember, during President Obama's administration, the economy recovered. The jobs start coming, but at a huge cost. But he saved the entire world economy, believe it or not. But we had to pay for it. That's why he couldn't do other programs that he wanted to do, because he only can do so much. But now we have a new president. Now people start complaining about the fact that we still have to borrow $1 trillion a year, or over $1 trillion a year, to cover the cost. Well, we have to look back at the programs that were introduced during President Obama. We have to look at the programs that were introduced during Bush era, and we have to look at the programs that were introduced during Clinton era. Some of those programs is going to take a while to take effect, and now we see the cost of that, especially the healthcare. The healthcare cost went from $250 billion a year to over $1 trillion a year. It's already been put in the budgets 3 years ago, for now. They are calculating. That's why even the ACA never took officially effect under President Obama's second term. And that's the reason behind that. Nobody wants to see the price tag until the president is re-elected for the second term. How can I even imagine what's going to be in the next 2 years? Not only with that, but we have to remember most of baby boomers start retiring. So Social Security went up from $200 billion to over $1 trillion. Now all those expenses is costing us money. And that's how we still have to borrow money. We don't bring enough revenue in because we just cannot keep taxing people until they cannot pay nothing. But when you look at the American people's budget today, you see the cost of healthcare going up. And that really concerns me right now. Everybody agrees the economy is doing great. Economy is doing great. However, I foresee another collapse in the next few years. Whether it's going to be 2, 3, or 4 years, nobody will know. It all depends on President Trump and his policies and what he's going to do about the economy. And it comes down to healthcare costs. When you look at your own budget, when you look at an average American people's budget, you're realizing that the healthcare costs have gone up. The cost of medication have gone up. When you look at senior citizens that depends on medication, they have to make a decision between their mortgage, their medication, food on the table, property taxes, whatever. They cannot afford all of it. So they have to make a decision which is the priority. That will create another issue. You're looking at people with diabetes. I know from my own experience, a couple years ago, I went to Germany to visit my mother, and she looked at me and she said, "Son, there is something wrong with you." I said, "Mom, I'm just tired. I'm working 8 hours a week. I work a lot. I'm just tired." She said, "No. The look in your face is telling me you have diabetes." I said, "Mom, you must be joking. I just went to the doctor. They told me I was fine." She said, "Okay, we'll see about that." So she took her testing kit because she has diabetes. She knows what the face of a person with diabetes looked like. And sure, my sugar was at 350. At that point, I started taking some medication, came back home, went to the doctor, and indeed, she put me on medication. Now, I didn't have to take insulin. And that's huge because the cost of insulin is very expensive in the United States. Many American people are dying, especially young people, because they cannot afford their full dose of insulin. They have to cut it in half. And because of that, again, it comes back to the budget. They only have so much money coming in, but not enough going out because of all those expenses. So that's why most Americans are dying, because they cannot afford the medication. They cannot afford a medication that shouldn't have cost that much money. It doesn't take that much money to make it. Why is it so expensive? Because companies are greedy. Now, the good news for me is, as you can see right now, talking to you guys, I do go for a walk. It might be 90 degrees outside, and I have this nice vest on me that makes me sweat. But the reality is, I'm no longer on medication for diabetes. My sugar level is perfect. Sometimes I wonder, sometimes I'm afraid because it's going too low, but I can manage that. And the truth is, we all have to make changes in our lives. We all have to make changes in our budget. Even for me, the medication was not an issue because I have a VA. I go to the VA. I just pay a small copay, which is not a big deal. I can do that. But most American people don't have that option. Most American people don't. So when you look at the national debt again, and we'll go into that because I had a good conversation with someone a few years ago, and my biggest issue was the foreign welfare, as I call it. Money that we give to other countries and we never see that money back. Some people say, well, we have to do it. Me personally, no, we don't. And I remember during President Obama administration, that budget was $160 billion a year. Now, $160 billion from a $3.9 trillion budget, it seems like, just tiny little portion of the budget. And my point on this was, listen, it's $160 billion. Money that we don't have, money that we have to borrow. Remember, we're borrowing close to $1 trillion every year under the last few years, where we cut it down to $600 billion and $500 billion a year. So that $160 billion, we didn't have it. We had to borrow it. That added to the national debt. Now we have to pay that money back with interest, but we'll never see that money. So maybe it is a time that we have to really look at the federal budget and figure out what is worth, what is not worth it. Where we have to make cuts, where we don't have to make cuts, because sooner or later we do have to make cuts. Not everybody will be happy, but just like my budget and your budget, we all know how much money we bring in every year. We know how much money goes out. And if we can balance our budget, we might have to change our lifestyles. I know I do, especially right now. That's a whole different story. But things change in real life. So when things change in real life, we have to change with it. And I'm here to say this. I think if we hit $30 trillion in national debt, we're going to have a huge problem. A huge problem. And I don't think nobody realizes that. We will not be able to keep borrowing around $750 billion a year to pay just the interest on that debt. Plus, we have to borrow more money for other programs. That's going to increase. I get President Trump into the office. He is to be blamed for the national debt. So be it if that's the case. Now, there is a way to pay that off. And we can talk about that on another video on how we can pay the national debt, and what will it take to do so. Not everybody will be happy, and the last two presidents that tried that end up getting killed, and that's the sad part. But there are powerful people in this world that will do anything to stop United States from paying the national debt off or changing their currency. But in reality is United States have to do something. The entire world will have to do something, not just the United States. I think it will be very important for China, Russia, Brazil, Germany, England, and other powerful nation, Japan, to get together and be like, hey, we do need to do something with our money system. We have to figure something out with our currencies. But that's another video. But for right now, what I'm saying is our national debt is going up. I will not be surprised if we don't see $1.2 trillion every year to be added to the national debt. I think it doesn't matter whether it's President Trump in the office or Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden or whoever is going to be in the office in the future. I think Trump, for some other reason, will have a chance to do 4 more years. The way everything goes out right now, I think us as Democrats, we're trying to do too much with free money, and we don't know how to pay for them, and that's going to hurt us in the long run. But for right now, let's remember the national debt is at $22 trillion, and it's going to go up every year by at least $1 trillion to $1.2 trillion, and that is to pay for our Social Security, our healthcare system, and to be honest with you, the healthcare system, it's a $3.5 trillion a year industry. I don't know how we're going to change that, but we have to change it. We have to figure out a way to change that industry in order to save some money and save and figure out a way to pay the national debt. Like I say, we can talk in another video about that. I believe to be the best plan for it, but the problem is I am not the president and I cannot make a change. I can only talk about it, but that's it. So for right now, let's remember this. The national debt, it is what it is. It's high. And when we hit $30 trillion, we're going to see the effect of it. But before we get there, I think another financial collapse will happen, and it will do to the healthcare cost unless we do something about it, because the premiums that families have to pay, when you look at I was not going to put this in this video, but let's do it really quick before we end the video. Think about a family of 4. So the wife and the husband works. They make good money. Let's say they make about $100,000 between them. That's $200,000. By the time when all the taxes, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, they'll end up bringing home about $100,000, right? So that's roughly, let's say, maybe it'll be over $100,000 because they are married. So let's say they bring home $8,000 a month. Now, the healthcare cost between them might be somewhere in the neighborhood of, depends who gets and where they work, but let's go with the average American family, and let's go down to $1,200 a month. And we're doing that as an average American family. Some pay less, some pay more. So that's $1,200 a month going for healthcare cost. Then they have 2 kids. They are in daycare. That's another $2,000 a month. So now we're at $3,200 a month. So remember, between them they bring $8,000 in. Between them, they have student loans. roughly $1,500 between the two of them that they have to pay back. So now you're 32 with 15, you're at 4,800. Then you got 2 car notes, let's say $800 a month. So that's 48.56. Car insurance, another $300. So mortgage, another $2,200 a month. Food, another $800 a month. Gas to go back and forth to work, another $300 a month. Are we missing something in here by now? If we do the math, where can we save money? And we're not even talking about entertainment. We're not talking about going eat at the restaurant or have a family day at Busch Gardens or have a vacation. We're not even talking about vacation because there's no money left for vacation at this point. So we do have a problem. And it goes back to that piece of pie. The piece of pie is only so big. It doesn't matter how you're going to move it around. The piece of pie cannot grow. Piece of pie will always be the same. The question of it, which industry is going to take the bigger bite of that pie? And right now, like I said, back in 2007, 2005, mortgage company took the big bite. Right now, the mortgage company is back at roughly 28 to 30%, which is not bad. That's more. But now we have other industries, healthcare industry, that is taking the bigger bite than before. Then the cost of living taking another bigger bite. So now an average family of 4 between 20 and 30, there's no way for them to save money. If they have 2 kids, they are done. So we have to find a way to reduce their budget. But how can we do it without changing everything that they're used to, or the cost of daycare? Now they'll have to wait until their kids are older, then they go to school, then their budget changes. But until then they might not even make it. Anyway, for this video, it's enough. It's the same thing as your budget is the federal budget. We do have to cut the federal budget, and how do we do it without creating chaos in our economy? Well, I'm glad I'm not the man in charge to do that, because if I was, unfortunately, a lot of programs will be cut, because that's the only way you can control the budget and you can pay your debt. I wish we could file bankruptcy, but that's not going to work. The Federal Reserve will never allow us to do that. And Federal Reserve is our biggest enemy today, more than anybody else. All right, see you guys next time, and join me for a walk.